You know, one of the things that my wife and I learned, and if you've ever been a parent, you know this, is that you parent differently as your kids get older, right? You all know this. You don't parent the same. So one of the things we wanted to teach our kids when they grew up was a level of independence, right? We told our kids from the time they were 10, you can't live here till you're 30, right? It was just, we kind of laid that out at the very beginning. And so we wanted to build into them this idea of independence. Well, when you're trying to teach a 5-year-old how to have a little independence, what do? For us, it looked like, you know, you're at McDonald's and you need an extra ketchup. We'd say, okay, we want you to walk over to that counter over there and ask that lady for another ketchup, right? They could do it. They never got out of your sight. They were right there, and they got to be brave and go do that. When they were 10, it was beginning to say, okay, you can go play in the woods behind our house. We don't need to be there for you, but there's specific boundaries. You know, they couldn't get lost where we were, so there was some freedom to explore their independence without risk, or without too much risk. When they were 15, it meant setting them loose in Disney on their own, saying, look, you have this entire thing to explore, to do by yourself. You can't really get off the property, but you're going to have to figure some stuff out, so go. Have fun. When they were 17, it meant letting them take the car, to be out in the evening, to teach them how to use a credit card, etc., etc. Now, we kind of all know this, but it would be foolish, wouldn't it, to tell a 5-year-old, yeah, go play in the woods by yourself, no big deal. Just as it would be foolish to try and control everything your 17-year-old did. You adapt as your kids grow. It's just the way it works. And when we talk about understanding the times, it means that when things change in our world, we cannot expect to do things the exact same way they've always been done. It will leave us frustrated and ineffective if we do. And next week we're going to talk about, methods versus message. But today I want to focus in on this idea of when we want to effectively respond to the time, we want to see God as a God of the new. Okay, so we're going to take a look at this morning. We're going to do it the same way we've done, by looking at an Old Testament and a New Testament view of this. But just like a parent who gives too much freedom to a 5-year-old or gives too little freedom to their 17-year-old, we will set ourselves up for problems if we don't constantly keep in our mind that God is a God of the new. Okay? You with me? All right, so let's take a look. We're going to look at two different things. We're going to look at the Old Testament first. Because here's the thing. If you lived in 500 AD, okay, so just think back. If you lived 1,500 years ago, your life looked largely like the life of your parents and your grandparents. And your kids' life was going to largely look like your life. Especially in the areas of technology and that, the changes were just very slow. Right? It was very deliberate. It's not that there wasn't change. It's just it didn't happen like it is today. But now, changes happen so fast. There are people in this room who have never seen a rotary phone. Okay? They have never seen one of those dumb computer terminals, right? They've never held a floppy disk. They've never used a record player, let alone even know what an 8-track is, okay? Conversely, some of you remember when microwaves were invented. You remember when color televisions actually became a thing, right? People that are graduating and going to college right now weren't alive when 9/11 happened. I mean, the pace of change is incredible. These kids now, 5 years old, they can't even imagine. If it's a screen, you can swipe it, right? Like if you ever watched a kid try to swipe a screen that doesn't swipe? They get very frustrated. They're like, I don't understand why this doesn't work, right? And it's not just technology, but even things like family. In 1960, 3/4 of children lived with two parents who were in their first marriage. And today, it's less than half. And it's declining. For thousands of years, people traveled on foot or by horse. And now we have cars, planes, and motorcycles, and bicycles. Do you know up to 100 years ago, the primary weapons had only moved from stabbing each other to guns and cannons. And now there are so many ways to destroy people, including our entire planet, right? I mean, it's all happened in the last few years. And I'm not trying to belabor this point, but change happens, and right now it's happening rapidly. And this isn't a bad thing. God actually designed us to change. He didn't design us to stay the same. He said that's part of what your created thing is. But it does create challenges when we're trying to understand the times because change happens. Think of it this way. If you were dropped onto the Delmarva Peninsula, okay, in 1970, we'll go back 50 years, and you knew nothing about it, you weren't from here, someone just said, I want you, and they put you here, and they said, I want you to reach people and tell them about the gospel. And you started to say, okay, well, how do I do that here? Now, if I took someone or maybe, let's say I take you and said, well, no, let's not do it there. Let's do it in 2023. I'm going to drop you in the middle of Delmarva Peninsula. Again, you know nothing about this place, but I want you to reach the people with the gospel of Jesus. You wouldn't do the same things, would you? It's totally different. It's changed, and it's only 50 years. Thankfully, God is a God of the new. He's always doing new things. He never lags behind culture, right? God's never behind the culture of the day. And in fact, he just deals with people. He graciously adapts to the world around us. So Isaiah, Old Testament, was a prophet. He lived about 700 years before Jesus. And he was born in a time when the nation of Israel was divided. And you all know your history. There was the northern kingdom of Israel, right, which split after the time of Rehoboam and then Jeroboam. And they kind of had this big split. And the northern kingdom, when that happened, was afraid of the influence of the south. So the south had Jerusalem. So the south was where people went to worship. And so when the kingdom split, the king in the north, Jeroboam, said, well, I don't want people going south to worship, because if they do, they might go back there, and I'm going to lose my kingdom. So instead, he set up 2 altars in Bethel and Dan. He put these golden calves and said, well, here, why don't you stay here, worship here. You don't need to go all the way to Jerusalem. That's a long way. And he picked priests who weren't Levites. He did this whole thing, and he set it up, and it caused problems for the next hundreds of years. And so the northern kingdom because they had done this, they were the more wicked of the 2 kingdoms. There was very little good about it. And they were warned and warned and warned and warned over the years of what was going to happen if they didn't repent, if they didn't come back to God. And in the end, God sent this nation called Assyria under the king Tiglath-Pileser. I don't even know if I said that way. But he was a brutal dictator who came in and destroyed the northern nation completely. Deported them, they're gone, wiped off the map. The problem was that the southern kingdom didn't really learn their lesson from this. So even though they might have had some better kings, they also had some bad ones. And so Isaiah is born into this time, and God gives him this assignment to tell the southern kingdom, you got to stay close to God. The same thing's going to happen if you do not listen. Don't just live your own way. He actually warned Israel, Isaiah did, that the Babylonians, a nation that wasn't even really in existence yet, was going to be the one that was going to conquer Judah, 100 years before it actually came to pass. And when it finally did come to pass, Isaiah's voice was vindicated. But instead of repenting and turning to God, which is what you would expect might happen after you got conquered by this, right? It's been predicted. Now it happens. You would think people would say, oh my goodness, he was right. We should really repent. It didn't happen. What they did was they began to blame God. They said, God, what's wrong? You abandoned us. You left us. The reasoning was, since we're your chosen people and you let us be conquered, you are neglecting us and you've left us on our own. So when we get to Isaiah 43, we read God's response. It kind of goes like this. This is what the Lord says. And by the way, this is in the middle of a whole section. It's almost like a courtroom that they're doing this. I'll come back to that in a second. And this is part of a whole response. But this is what the Lord says. He who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters, who drew out the chariots and the horses, the army and the reinforcements together, and they lay there never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. And we're going to come back to this, because obviously that probably sounds very familiar to most of you. He said this, forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? Do you not understand it? Don't you see it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. The wild animals honor me, the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland to give drink to my people, my chosen, the people I form for myself, that they may proclaim my praise. Now, this whole section actually is about 5 chapters. As I said, it was almost written like a trial where God is arguing for the prosecution, right? Israel is the defense because they've been making these accusations against God and they've had these complaints. But we're zeroing in on this piece here because the whole point of verse 18 and 19 is the contrast God is making between the old and the new. And if you think about it, what God was really saying to Israel, he says, and he kind of goes through this, he says, look, the whole model, the thing that I created all those hundred centuries ago, was that you guys, as a nation, were supposed to follow me. When you did that, all the nations around you who were not my chosen people, they were going to see what you guys did and go, oh, look what happens when you follow the true God, and they were going to be drawn towards God. That was the intent. They did not do that. And so God said, look, you know what? I'm going to do something brand new. I'm going to do it this whole new way. I'm going to actually take that wasteland of unbelief. I'm going to make a new way for people to come to me. There's a simple truth. God acts in new ways to bring people to him in every single age. This isn't new. Right? He did this all the time. When mankind was sinful, he sent a flood. And then do you remember the promise he made at the end? Never going to do that again. Right? Because, by the way, that's what church people do, right? If you do a thing one time, people go, that was so great. It's a tradition. We should do this all the time, right? That's just what we do as people. And God says, yeah, I did that. Never going to happen again. I'm going to do something new. So he goes on and he says, you know what? I'm going to do something new. And he picks Abraham and says, Abraham, I'm going to choose you, not for any reason other than I'm going to pick you, and I'm going to make you into this amazing nation that's going to help save the world. Then hundreds of years later, he says, you know, I'm going to do something brand new. I'm going to rescue you guys from Egypt. You're a nation now. And I'm going to give you laws that nobody's ever seen before. Nothing is like this in the world today. I'm going to give you these new set of laws. I want you to live by those. It's a whole brand new way of doing it again. And then when they didn't follow that, he says, well, let me do something new. I'm going to send prophets and kings to help you get there. And now he's saying to them again, I'm going to do something new yet again. I am going to send you a Messiah. A suffering Messiah. And that salvation is going to transcend anything you've ever experienced in the past. But there's a couple things I noticed, and the reason why this is so practical for us is this. Embracing God's new means we have to hold the old loosely. Now, I don't know if you caught what he said right before he says, I'm doing a new thing. I don't know if you remember. He says, what is he referring to here? He says, look, I made the way through the sea, the pathway through, the chariots and the horses. What is he talking about? Egypt, right? When they came out, he parted the Red Sea. This was one of the things the Israelites remembered. This was kind of the ultimate victory of God. We delivered them from Egypt. He parted the Red Sea. They go through, and when Pharaoh goes through, they come over. It destroyed everything. It basically wrecked the nation. Look what he says. I did that. That's the one who's telling you this. I'm not doing that right now. I'm doing something different. You want me to keep doing what you're doing. You want me to conquer the nations the same way. You want me just to intervene and wipe everybody out the way I did back then. I did those things. That was me. That was God. You can acknowledge that and even celebrate it, but I'm not doing that now. See, the temptation, and it's a very strong one, is to get locked into the past, into the forms and the programs, and we waste time moaning about how things used to be. And this is not new, because I just happened to read in my devotions this morning in the book of Proverbs where he says we're not supposed to say how good it used to be. So if that was happening during the time of Solomon, well, this has been going on for a long time, right? But we get caught in this trap of the way it used to be, and we hold so tightly onto what it is. Let me give you an illustration. Have you ever had a child and they have candy? Have you ever watched them do this? And they do something like this, right? Especially at Halloween. And they have handfuls of candy like this, okay? And then you come to them with a gift that's even better. Now, have you watched what a child does? They're like, I want that, but I don't want to let go of these. And so then you'll see them, they'll try and take it, and they'll kind of balance it on their arms, right? And then all of a sudden, candy starts falling out, and then they're reaching down to pick that up, and they drop something else. And you can see this. You know what's going on, right? You watch this happen. They're so intent on holding on to what they had that they can't enjoy the thing they're being given. By the way, anybody can come up and have candy after. This is the danger. And this is what God is kind of saying to Israel. He says, guys, let go. Let go. You're holding on to this picture of the way I'm going to do things. I'm not doing it like that now. I'm doing something new. And then it's very interesting because not only do we have to hold it loosely, but when we resist the new, we actually can miss God's plan. He says this kind of weird little sentence, this little bit here about the animals honoring him. And God is saying, look, you're missing this. The animals will honor me for what I'm doing, even though you won't. The things I'm doing, they will see, and you will miss it. It is very tempting to cling to the past and insist that God keep our comfort zone intact, but that's a trap. We will be caught by surprise if our nostalgia always has us looking in the rearview mirror. If you drove your car looking in the rearview mirror instead of looking that way, it wouldn't go very well. And by the way, for those that are young, this isn't a trap yet because you haven't been alive long enough. You'll get there. It'll be the same for you someday. Okay? And what's even worse is when we resist the new, not only will we miss God's plan, we sometimes are in opposition to God's plan. Never a place we want us to be. Now, all this leads us to Jesus, because I said we're going to look at the Old Testament and then the New. And so 700 years after all this happened, Jesus is seizing on a very similar teaching. Now, we're going to look at it. It's in Luke chapter 5, if you're interested. And Luke records a whole bunch of things that Jesus did in Luke chapter 5. You can kind of read through them. It goes like this. They were all very controversial things that he did. First of all, he heals a paralyzed man, and then forgives his sins. He didn't even ask to have his sins forgiven. And he forgives sins. And the people are like, what are you doing? You don't get to do that. Only God gets to do that. Then, and the religious leaders, they saw this as blasphemy. Then he goes on to have a dinner with a bunch of tax collectors, people you were never supposed to hang with. It was a no-no in that culture. They were the lowest of the lowest, especially for someone who was a rabbi and a leader. He's like, Jesus, you can't do that. You don't understand. You're hanging out with the wrong people. That's not what you're supposed to do. The law says you're supposed to be separate. Then he gets questioned because everybody else was doing this religious practice of fasting, and Jesus and his disciples weren't. They're like, why aren't you doing this? This is what the law says. You're supposed to be doing this. And he has all this, they're pointing in, they're all saying, Jesus, you're not doing this right. You're not following God the way you're supposed to. So Jesus, in the masterful way that he does, says, well, let me tell you something. He told them this parable. No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise, they'll have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new one won't match the old. No one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new, for they say the old is better. And if I was a disciple, I would have turned to Jesus and I would have said, Jesus, I know you think you're being clear. This is not clear. I don't get it. This makes no sense to me, right? So you can kind of picture, like, Jesus is really he's leaning into the same thing that Isaiah was. He was contrasting the old and the new. The Jewish people, particularly those who were religious in their mindset, had a system that called for certain actions. They followed the law of Moses, with all the laws from the Torah and all the traditions that were wrapped around that. So salvation, right standing before God, it was achieved through this scrupulous observance of the law as they interpreted it. He was going to bring the salvation of Israel about when they leaned in, obeyed everything God wanted them to do, and then God would free them and make them a significant people. Again, everybody knew that. That was how religion went down. And Jesus is saying, look, there's something totally new going on here, people. The actions in that chapter alone were so different that it was disturbing. We read them and it doesn't make a big deal to us, but to them they were like, you're missing this. I can't believe you're doing this, Jesus. Everybody knows that God doesn't like this. What are you doing? And Jesus says, no, I'm doing something new. And as I read through that, I notice a couple things. When God is doing a new thing, it can sometimes be incompatible with the old. And so he uses two metaphors to describe it. One is on clothes. You guys all know that clothes shrink the first time that you wash them and dry them, right? Almost always. I bought a sweater once in Europe, and it was this beautiful knit sweater, and then we weren't even thinking because we got back, wore it, said, oh, it needs to be washed, and now it's Yvonne's sweater. Because that's just what happens, right? But you know how that works. So if you have a garment that's already been through the wash 100 times, and in his illustration, he's like, well, you put a brand new fabric on there that's never been washed, and you sew it up, and then it goes through the wash, it shrinks. The other garment doesn't. What happens? It ruins the whole thing. Wrecks it, pulls it apart, the stitches rip. And then he uses the illustration of the wineskins. And old wineskins, so ones that had been used many times, they'd been stretched, right? They'd already been put in, they kind of were set in their shape, and they didn't have a lot of flexibility left in them. And when you made new wine, it still tended to, I don't even know what the term is, it's not oxidized, but it releases gases. It still is fermenting. And so what happened is you needed a new wineskin that actually still had some flex in it, right? You know what that's like if you ever tried to get into a pair of jeans from 30 years ago, right? The new ones that have lots of flex are way better. But you know how that works, right? So if you put this in, the wineskin, if it's an old one that has no more flex, and all of a sudden it begins to expand, all of a sudden it just goes, poof, blows up, wrecks the wine, wrecks the wineskin. So this is the picture Jesus was using to show the incompatibility of the law and the new covenant, saying that they don't work together, not the way you guys think they should work together. And so you see in here a couple things. Sometimes tweaking the old is not enough. Because what was happening was people were saying, and we do this in our culture all the time, I'm going to take what I know, I'm going to take what I believe, and I'm going to add a little bit of Jesus to it. I'm going to take my life. I like my life. It's the good American life. But you know what? I'm going to add a little bit of Jesus to it. The religious leaders, they did this. Look, we have the law. We have all this stuff. Okay, some of the stuff you're saying, Jesus, that's pretty cool. You know, maybe if we just kind of took that and stick it in here, we'll add it to what we already do. And Jesus is saying it doesn't work that way. You can't just necessarily tweak what was going on because I'm doing something brand new. You can't add Jesus to legalism. You can't add Jesus to a life that's focused on prestige. You can't add Jesus to your desires for a conqueror. It doesn't work. I'm coming to do something new. And by the way, it doesn't invalidate what happened before, right? You notice that Jesus isn't criticizing the old. He's just saying, we're just not doing it that way anymore. There's something new going on. Because he was the author of the law. He was the author of all that. It was a good thing, but I'm doing something new. Our tendency can be to take what we're comfortable with and add just a little bit of new to it to make us feel a little better about it. But we still get to hold on to the old. It's kind of like, right? Diet Coke, the one drink God created in the Garden of Eden before there was sin. Well, it's a beautiful thing. I'm currently not drinking soda, so I'm missing out on God's blessings. But you say, okay, I got this amazing thing, and someone says, well, you know, it's really not that good for you. You probably should drink water instead. And you think, oh, Coke, water. What would happen if I just take a little bit of water? See, you know exactly what that is, right? And you say, well, it kind of still looks like Coke. I am not going to drink that, right? And you water it down. Oh, I'm just going to add something different to it. I'm going to tweak it a little bit. And it ends up wrecking both things. The problem is simply this. The old is often then more comfortable and satisfying than the new. Jesus makes this very interesting comment that I didn't understand for a long time when I was younger. He says, and no one after drinking the old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better. You know what he's saying? We're comfortable with what was. We like what we used to do. we're used to it. It's the right style. It's the way I like to worship. It's the way I like to read. It's the way I like to deal with people. It's the way I like to go to church. It's the way I like to work. I'm used to all those things. I've done it for decades. I'm comfortable with it. And Jesus says, look, here's the new. And you have a sip of the new and you're like, oh, it's just water. I want the old because you know what? This is so much better. I'm going to have a sip. Oh, that's so good. Right? But you know what I mean? It's like, no, I'm comfortable with the old. It's what I like. I mean, that's the thing I'm comfortable with. And Jesus is saying, you know what happens? If you don't embrace the new, it's like going back to what you're comfortable with, and you're saying, you know what? This is better. And what we do as human beings, especially as Christ followers, is we dress up and we say, well, God actually likes this better. This is the real way. This is the godly way. This is the holy way. What we're really saying is, I like this better, so I'm going to make sure that I'm comfortable that I like this and that God likes this too. And Jesus was like, no, I'm doing something new. People did not understand or want to follow Jesus when he was around, mostly, especially with the religious leaders, because it threatened what they were already comfortable with. Which means new systems might be required to reach people for the kingdom in the times in which you live. The new covenant that Jesus was instituting was simply not going to fit with the preconceived ideas and all the structures the religious people had of the day. They were going to have to change. They needed new wineskins. You know, the Holy of Holies, the old forms of temple worship, they weren't going to be needed anymore. The Holy of Holies, the thing that was the heart of their temple, was actually not going to be necessary. The heart was more important than the external. The Holy Spirit was actually going to come and live in his people all the time. This was new. And so if you're trying to drink more water, sometimes you say, you know what, in order for that to happen, I need a new container. I can't carry around a glass of water. I can carry around a bottle of water because I can have it with me. I can lock it up when I'm not drinking it. And I get used to the new. We're going to talk about this a little bit more next week. The idea of what does that look like? We say there might be new systems required. But for now, suffice it to say, we sometimes have to do things differently because God is at work and he's a God of newness. He's always doing something new. Here's why I'm telling you all this. This is in light of everything we're doing with the missional outpost. We're going to have to do brand new things we've never done before to reach a world that doesn't look like it used to. Unless you're not sure of that, let me give you some stats. There's 8.1 billion people on planet Earth today, okay, which is actually astonishing because there was 1 billion in 1900. That's how fast it's grown. And the makeup of that population is changing, okay? Do you know there are 43 million blind people around the world? There are 430 million deaf people. 650 million disabled people. Do you know that there are more people, blind, deaf, and disabled, than there were on the entire planet 125 years ago? It's crazy. 300 million migrants. You know what that means? 1 in 25 people live in a country they were not born in. And here's something I did not know. 1 in 6 of those live in this country. So 153 million orphans in the world. There are 685 million people who live in extreme poverty as defined by living on less than $2.50 a day. And if you do multidimensional poverty, which is a little bit of a broader scope, it's 1.2 billion people. 160 million people are addicted to alcohol and drugs, and there were 100,000 overdose deaths in the USA last year. The world is not what it was, friends. Now, some of this is pretty overwhelming because you look at those numbers, they almost don't mean anything, so let's draw a little closer to home. Within 3 miles of this church, Okay? This is studies that we pulled. Our district helps us get this. 3 miles. That's it. So most of you don't even live within this 3-mile circle, but within 3 miles in any direction of our church, there are 13,000 people. The makeup of that is about 60% white, 25% African American, 10% Latino, and some others. Do you know that there are over 20 languages spoken in our school in Seaford? Do you know that homelessness in Delaware doubled from 2020 to 2022, and most of that was in Sussex County? Catch this one. There are 250 homeless kids attending our schools in Seaford, as defined by kids that have no permanent home. They might be couch surfing, they might be living in a car, they might be living in a hotel. The average household income is actually about $71,000, which seems okay until you realize that over 20% live on under $25,000 a year. Households, not people, households. 50% of people are married. That's 1 in half. 20% are widowed or divorced. That's just around us. And then if you look at just the attitudes of people towards religion and so on, this is just amazing to me. In the U.S., do you know that 1 in 10 Christians thinks church is irrelevant? Interesting. Huh. Yet, 2/3 of people value warm, friendly, welcoming people and environments. And serving. Do you know they did a survey? 1 in 5 of people are disappointed most of the time about their Sunday morning experience. And that only 1 in 5 non-Christians have a positive perception of the local church. 1 in 5 attend church once per week. Only 1 in 5 people. And get this, 80% of non-Christians say the church should be more outward focused. Not the people inside, the people outside. The people that have no use for the church and think it's largely irrelevant said the church would be more relevant if they were more focused on the needs of the people instead of on themselves. The majority of non-Christians do not trust local pastors. There is no advantage for me to tell people I'm a pastor anymore if you're outside the church. And millennials and Gen Xers, less than half. These are the ones that are churchgoers, would ever want to commit to or become a member of a church. All of that has to get taken into account to understand the times. Because the world's so different than it was even 20 years ago. Understanding the times, it does 2 things. Understanding the times actually helps us effectively respond to them because the world around us is changing, God is a God of new things. None of this is unknown to him. None of this has God wringing his hands. None of this has God going, oh, I don't know what to do. God says, I get it. I know. I understand. I'm doing new things. I'm reaching these people. Will you join me? So how do we respond? How do you respond? We're going to talk a little bit more next week when we talk about the kind of the nitty-gritty of what that might look like. But it may cause us to ask some questions. There are implications for being Sunday-centric in church. Building-centric. It has implications on the things we do to make Jesus heard, or the personal responsibility of each person. Next week, we're going to look at what it means to adapt with this God of Newness, to change systems without compromising, because this is a danger. Churches compromise the message of the gospel. We don't want to do that. But he's a God of newness. And so we're going to look at the difference between systems and people. There are so many opportunities. We were at a lay leader conference this weekend, and one of the stats that was shared was that over half people say they have no friend that knows them. 40% say they have no close friends. My friends, we are surrounded by people that are lonely, that want something. They need Jesus and they want someone to love them. If we just only leaned into that, it might change everything we do. Basil of Caesarea. Do you know who this guy is? He lived between 330 and 379 AD. And he looked at his culture in his time, and this is kind of coming out of the Roman times when there was a lot of persecution kind of on and off, and they were kind of reaching the end of that. And he looked around, and he looked at his culture, and he said, there's just something wrong in my culture. Especially with the people who were marginalized, the poor, the abused. They died so frequently. They had no recourse to help. And so this saint of old, he read the words of Jesus. And he said, he came to the conclusion that what Jesus was saying was, if you had the resources to help people in need and you didn't, you were stealing from them. Listen to this. This is from one of Basil's sermons. The bread that you hold back belongs to the hungry. The coat that you guard in a chest or in a closet belongs to the naked. The shoes that you have left wasting away belong to the shoeless. The silver that you have buried in the ground belongs to the needy. In this and other ways, you have wronged all those you were able to provide for. He was so convicted about what he read from Jesus that he started the first public hospital in the history of humanity. Because up until that point, there was medical available for the rich. If you were, you would go to a temple or a shrine to sacrifice. If you gave enough, you could get medical care. It was there. The armies would have it for their soldiers. There had never been anything for the public in terms of medical care. And so what he did was he said, I am going to do something different and new, because that's what Jesus is doing. And he did something new, and it literally changed civilization as we know it. So let's not be dismayed. Our world is changing. It does look dark, but we don't need to be dismayed. Instead, let's seek the God of newness, who wants to do a new thing, to draw people from this age to himself.